There are any number of potential pitfalls that you can encounter while braving the roads of Darkest Dungeon 2. From enemies to mechanics to stress, and even your party's relationships, there's plenty of ways to fail. That's why I'm here today with more information to smooth out that journey, at least a little bit.
Rise again to reclaim a glimmer of hope from the spreading stain of the Darkest Dungeon.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. I'm loving covering Darkest Dungeon 2 here on the channel, and if you're enjoying my coverage as well, a subscription to the channel would mean the world. Thank you. First off, choose paths without armor or wheel-breaking obstacles whenever possible. When you're planning your route through a region, it's important to keep an eye out for armor or wheel-breaking obstacles. These obstacles can become incredibly frustrating incredibly quickly, as if you run out of the relevant points by hitting too many, you will be forced into a battle. In these battles, a random hero in your party will be forced to take no actions other than repairing the cart for a turn, and will also either be given a vulnerable token or gain stress on their turn depending on the encounter type. This can be devastating in a tough fight, and while it won't often end a run, the possibility of losing a hero, or at the very least taking a ton of damage, is high. So, try to avoid paths that damage your coach whenever you can. You'll scout some, but not all of these paths unless you have specific traits, and there are times where every path you take will lead to damage. So by dodging them early, you can hopefully take those hits without getting stuck in pointless battles. Number 2, keep combat items equipped whenever possible. In Darkest Dungeon 2, items you can use in battle are significantly stronger than their counterparts in the first game. These items don't cost an action to use, and they can restore HP while curing status effects, restore light to the flame, or inflict damage and debuffs on the enemy. Really, there's no reason not to slap an item into an open slot on a party member, even if it doesn't really match that character's normal role. Simply equipping combat items to them can still improve their effectiveness in combat. If the location you're in features a lot of fire-wielding enemies, bring your burn salves, of course, but it doesn't hurt to slap on some bandages as well. Until you learn exactly what every enemy can do, there's really no reason not to be over-prepared, and enemies will often overlap status effects, so just because things are on fire doesn't mean you won't need to bandage a wound, you know? It's also important to consider your team's specific weaknesses when selecting these combat items. If they're prone to receiving stress damage that they can't easily get rid of, getting your hands on some spring water from oases will be vital. Conversely, if your team is lacking in healing capabilities, try to focus on items that can help patch up that weakness. Healing salves, burn salves, bandages, and the like will all help here. Foregoing or forgetting about combat items will hinder you way more than you might expect. The benefits that these items provide might seem small individually, but it absolutely can stack up over the course of a run. So keep an eye on these consumables. You'll be glad that you did. Number 3, pay attention to tokens, both yours and the enemy's. Taking the place of most RNG mechanics from the first game, tokens are a vital aspect of the combat mechanics of Darkest Dungeon 2. From block to dodge to strengthen and weaken, applying buffs and debuffs will dramatically change the direction of any given fight. As such, knowing which tokens you can apply regularly and what ones the enemy will most commonly be using against you will help immensely. When you encounter a new enemy, take note of any tokens that pop up over the course of the battle, and consider how they may affect that battle. For example, the Highwayman can grant himself the critical, dodge, and riposte tokens, dramatically increasing his damage output and reducing the damage he takes. Knowing which heroes have which tokens can help you plan your strategy and make better use of their unique abilities. Of course, your enemies are very likely to do the same, so take out nasty enemies with strong token applying abilities where you recognize them, and lean into the tokens your heroes like the most to maximize your efficiency. Number 4, use heroes with negative tokens to remove positive tokens from the enemy. Speaking of tokens, while having debuffing tokens tossed on your team is never fun, they can be put to use with the right strategy. After all, what's stopping you from using your hero who's afflicted with a debuff to remove the enemy's buff? What do I mean by this? Well, consider an enemy with the dodge token. Typically, your chances to hit such a unit will be no better than a flip of the coin. But if you have a hero with the blind token, who would probably miss anyway, you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Use your blinded hero to attack the dodging enemy, and even if your hero misses due to their blind token, it will still also use up the enemy's dodge token, making them vulnerable to the rest of your party members' attacks. By taking advantage of negative tokens and strategically removing positive ones, you can greatly increase your chances of survival against the cursed enemies of the countryside. Number 5, use damage over time attacks, or dots, to break block. Similarly to our previous point using blind tokens against enemies who have dodge tokens, block tokens will have a major impact on any encounter that they appear in. On your heroes, they will drastically increase your survivability, but of course, the same can be said for your enemies. Coming in 50% and 75% damage block variants, knowing how to deal with these blocking enemies can mean shorter battles, and as such, less damage on your heroes. And that's where the damage over time effects, or dots, come in. These attacks will inflict blight, burn, or the bleed status effects, all of which will cause enemies to take the relevant damage type at the start of every turn they take for a set number of turns. Due to this overall damage, the initial damage of the attack is typically quite low, and that's why they're effective against block. After all, losing 50% of a total of 4 damage off of a Grave Robber's poison darts doesn't feel too bad, compared to a big chop from your leper dropping anywhere from 9 to like 15 total damage. But the noteworthy thing is that block can't prevent the dot effect from being applied, nor can it reduce the damage it deals. So you can use up an enemy's block token with your dots, hardly losing any damage in the process, and leave them vulnerable again to those big direct damage attacks from the rest of your team. As always, the same thing can happen to you though, so be wary of enemies with blight, bleed, or burn attacks. Number 6, focus down enemies with stress attacks first. The stress mechanic is a hallmark of Darkest Dungeon, and in many ways, it's a more important mechanic to manage than health is. After all, recovering health is generally easier to do than reducing stress, and the meltdowns that occur when stress maxes out can quickly snowball into other meltdowns for other heroes, undoing all of the progress and buffs you've acquired from building your party's relationships. With this in mind, try to identify enemies that inflict the most stress damage in fights, and focus them down whenever possible. This is made more difficult by such enemies often hiding in the back of an enemy formation, and by their frequent use of dodge, stealth, and block tokens to help them avoid damage. Bringing heroes that can reliably hit the backline will help with this immensely, of course, so try to bring some heroes on every run that can do just that. Don't be afraid to use combat items to sneak in extra damage on these enemies as well, as these items are often able to target any line in a formation and can deal damage while applying useful dot effects. This makes them a great include for your fighters who may not normally have reliable backline attacks. Number 7, work to raise ally relationships whenever possible. In our previous point, we mentioned the importance of the relationships that you could potentially lose when you have a meltdown, but what makes those relationships so good, and why is building a strong relationship so important? Unlike the first game, where each hero's stress was largely self-contained beyond the occasional affliction, your party will rely on each other regularly now. Allies with positive relationships with one another can provide significant buffs to each other during combat, such as increased damage output or reduced stress gains. In some cases, they may even get free attacks to back up their friends and loved ones. Conversely, poor relationships can lead to increased stress, heroes attacking each other, and even negative tokens being applied to each other when you use certain attacks. For example, a Vestal becoming vulnerable and getting a taunt token whenever your Grave Robber throws poison darts. It's definitely not something I've ever experienced. No, not at all. While a lot of relationship management comes down to how high or low your stress levels are, there are ways to influence it directly. Heroes with abilities that target and support one another will see plenty of relationship changes for the better, and heroes can spawn with quirks that naturally increase their relationships as well. Though it's important to note that negative quirks can also affect ally relationships, so be sure to manage your hero's quirks carefully, and consider removing them if needed. Finally, using in-items like the playing cards can increase your relationships as well, so keep an eye out for useful items like that. Number 8, don't bother fighting a Lair boss without a team built to kill it. The lairs in each location and the bosses that lie at the end of them are a vitally important stop on your trip to the mountain and the final boss that lurks within it. This is due to the fact that, to even gain access to the final boss in some later runs, you will have to have defeated a Lair boss to prove your worth and be allowed entrance. But these Lair bosses are no easy challenge themselves. They have unique mechanics, high health pools, and hard-hitting attacks, which make them more than capable of wiping your party and ending your run if you aren't prepared. Each boss demands certain capabilities in a team to survive, and while you will of course need to fight them at least once to learn what they do, beyond that first attempt, you shouldn't attempt the fight unless those preparations are complete. Let's take the Sleeping General, boss of the Tangle, for example. To even engage with his mechanics, you must have multiple heroes who can target rank 4, the backline of the general's ranks, as well as numerous ways to manage stress. Lacking either will see your whole team getting locked down and killed in relatively short order. So, when you're proceeding through a run, assess your team's capabilities and make sure that they can handle the fight. Equip your heroes with specific abilities and combat items that can take advantage of a boss's weaknesses and resist their attacks, and try to recognize when you just don't have what it takes to challenge one of these foes. Like a great woman once said, after all, if it sucks, hit the bricks. And when it comes to these bosses, if you would like specific guides about how to handle each of them and what their mechanics are, let me know. I'd be happy to make them. Moving on to point 9. Be prepared to work around abilities that become afflicted by a negative relationship. Part of the relationship mechanics in Darkest Dungeon 2 see abilities becoming afflicted or virtuous, similarly to how heroes could become the same in Darkest Dungeon 1. Occurring after a stay at the inn between locales, the strength or weakness of your relationships will determine who has their abilities affected and whether it's a positive or negative change. In a situation where your abilities are afflicted, you'll see one ability from each hero in the relationship gain consequences when you use them. Remember that Vestal who became vulnerable and taunted enemies whenever my grave robber threw darts? The scenario I mentioned a few points back said it definitely didn't happen to me. It definitely did happen to me, and it was due to this system. It can quickly become a problem, especially if the affected ability is vital to your strategy. It's something that can only be planned around so much, to be fair, but try to have redundancies built into your strategy to work around it for when it does happen, because it will. There's no getting around it. Also, don't try to be clever by just unequipping the afflicted skill. It doesn't work. They're locked onto your hero until such a time the affliction ends, so good luck with that. And number 10, there's no shame in running away. Sometimes when you come to a combat encounter, you can just leave. One of your heroes may wish to skedaddle rather than fight another pack of rabid dogs or ravenous lunatics or whatever, and really, who can blame them? It's a reasonable option to take, especially if your health is low, your stress high, and or your flame fading. God forbid it be all three at once, because that's just not a good run. These battles don't always have the best rewards for clearing them in the first place, and even the best rewards mean nothing if you wipe and lose the run. If you're in a position where you don't feel comfortable taking the fight to the enemy, and a hero is offering you a way out, don't hesitate to take it. You don't want to do this all the time, of course. You will need some loot from your victories, and clearing battles can help reduce the loathing in an area, which makes enemies stronger, but it's not always a requirement that you take every fight either. And that, my friends, is 10 more tips to help you find victory in Darkest Dungeon 2. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, or at least learned something. If you are feeling generous and you want to show your appreciation for what I do have a Patreon and YouTube memberships that you can sign up for, but at the least, please do leave a like if you enjoyed. If you have other tips you'd like to suggest, please feel free to share in the comments, and leave any feedback you'd like to give there as well. With all that said, though, my name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.